1853, Edo, Japan. The American Armada is about to blow up everything that the Japanese hold dear. The American commander, Commodore C. Perry, has his cannons locked on to the city. His demands to the shogun, the de facto ruler of Japan, are clear. Open Japan to commercial relations, or have your city blown to utter smithereens.
Hello, I'm Jonah Carter. The United States didn't always hold such a powerful command of the Pacific that would allow them to deliver such a threat to the Japanese to strike fear into their hearts. Following the U.S. Navy's great success in the War of 1812, they earned themselves a much greater funding. They used this greater funding to create several new vessels, further strengthening their naval force. The great naval power that the U.S. now wielded at this time allowed them to begin their control of the Pacific and parts of Eastern Asia. Western nations such as the U.S. and many in Europe had economic interests in opening Japan to trade. Many saw Japan's isolationist policies as something that was bad for both Japan and themselves. Opening them to trade was sort of a win-win then. The whole point of trading is for both sides to get something that is beneficial. However, Japan was entrenched in a long tradition of isolating themselves, and it would take more than peaceful negotiations to sway them. Thus, in the view of the United States and Europe, there was really no other option than a military confrontation. Commodore Perry's attack of Edo only marked the beginning of U.S. influence in the Pacific. Spanish and Portuguese influence in the Americas and the Pacific continued to decline throughout the 19th century, and the brief Spanish-American War in 1898 all but ended any influence that Spain still wielded. The U.S. took possessions of Spain's Caribbean holdings and also forced them to forfeit their only remaining Pacific colonies in the Philippines and Guam. This was the beginning of American imperialism in the Pacific.
Edo was surrounded by Commodore Perry's gunships. The shogun only has two options: utter destruction or giving in to the demands of the Americans. Seeing the power of the powerful gunships, the shogun chooses instead to open Japan to commerce instead of seeing his beloved capital destroyed. The many years of isolation had badly stunted Japan's economic and technological growth. New Western technologies had not yet reached Japan, giving the U.S. an insurmountable technological advantage over the Japanese. Their economy was also in utter shambles due to declining agricultural productivity, an issue that the Western nations had mostly solved with industrial advances.
This concession to the Americas was the nail in the coffin of the Tokugawa shogunate. The sudden intrusion of foreign powers into the long, isolated island of Japan angered many of the Japanese lords, known as the daimyo, who saw the shogun as weak in giving in to foreign demands.
Shortly after the Japanese concession to the Americans, many other nations saw a great opportunity to take advantage of the situation. Diplomats from Russia, Britain, and Netherlands soon gained treaties with the Japanese, similar in nature to the treaty with the Americans, and to the treaties forced upon to the Qing dynasty in China. While many see these unequal treaties as a major setback to the Japanese, the opening of trade with Japan also allowed them to adopt foreign technologies and military techniques, which in the long run allowed them to become globally competitive.
The Tokugawa shogunate had already been in decline for many years to this point. Agricultural production was at its lowest, and there were many famines. Heavy taxes caused the economy to regress heavily, and many peasants suffered from these taxes, and low yields forced them to sell their lands and to work on farms they did not own. Opponents of the shogun rallied around the emperor in Kyoto and quickly formed a resistance against the ruling government.
Yeah!
government fought vigorously against these rebels, but to no avail. Once realizing that defeat was imminent, the shogun stepped down from his power and the rule of the emperor was reinstated. The emperor was a boy at this time, and his name was Mushuhito, but he was known by his name Meiji after taking power. Thus began the Meiji period of Japan. If it weren't for the American and European intrusion into Japan led by the shogun, tensions may have not risen to this point. This demonstrates how foreign nations can indirectly cause the shift of power in other countries.
After Emperor Meiji took power, he began to implement several reforms of modernization that drastically changed the government, military, and economy of Japan. It began with persuading the daimyo to give up their lands in exchange for titles and nobility.
亲爱的文，你是个很好的文，我可以给你这个字吗？
哇，你这么酷，穿的衣服这么好看，可是你的字恶心死了，我不要你的字。
谢谢，亲爱的文。
哇，谢谢给我这个字。好，你走吧。
你可以给我什么东西？
哦，我给你这个欧美万 Motion 内入 Peter Weller。
谢谢，太不行了。
好走，你傻不拉几。
After this, the government took control of lands and organized them into districts for central control. A powerful national army was created in accordance to Western military standards, which ensured that the Meiji rule would receive no threats from interior sources. A constitution was adopted, modeled after the governments of Europe and America. This greatly modernized the political system and the breath of fresh air after centuries of feudalism.
哇，我的新 Constitution 那么好哇，别人都喜欢，我也喜欢，哇。
The emperor also instituted a parliament, which he said was implemented as a gift to his people. This parliament was known as the National Diet, and the lower chamber was elected by popular vote. However, much power was still reserved to the executive branch and the emperor. The Meiji government also westernized the economy and industry of Japan. Industrial transportation methods such as railroads and steamboats were adopted. Much of the industry was controlled by the government and was sold to private investors, further cementing the arrival of capitalism in Japan. Iron and steel production became a massive industry in Japan, which grew along with the government-supported shipbuilding industry.
Industrialization did not come as easily to Japan as it did to countries in Europe and America. Japan is a relatively small island and did not have the same luck and resource density as Great Britain. This forced Japan to branch outward for resources. They encouraged colonists to settle in islands in the north to create a presence there before the Russians could. They took over many surrounding islands, and in 1876 they forced Korea into treaties that greatly favored themselves. A war over Korea that broke into the late 19th century between China and Japan ended rather quickly, with Japan taking control of Korea, Taiwan, and parts of the Chinese mainland. Many Japanese businessmen established interests in these areas, much like the capitalist investors in Europe and America took advantage of the home country's interests in foreign countries. Thus, Japan reacted to the spread of global capitalism by joining in on it.
Their adoption of industrialization and capitalism allowed Japan to compete with Western powers and dominate its Asian neighbors like never before. This was despite them being behind technologically for several centuries, which just goes to show how quickly the process of industrialization can change a country. A country that was behind governmentally, militarily, economically, and technologically for over a century was now on par with or more advanced than the rest of the world. This initiated a new era for Japan, in which the rest of the industrialized world saw Japan as a worthy rival and imperial power, no longer a secluded piece of land to be taken advantage of.